What if the airline industry's most trusted name was quietly heading toward its own disaster? For years, while Boeing burned through its reputation with grounding orders, whistleblower scandals, and tragic crashes, Airbus stood confidently in the spotlight as aviation's responsible adult, the engineering-driven alternative that simply got things right. Passengers boarded Airbus jets with a sense of quiet confidence, and airlines placed record orders without hesitation. But then within a single week in late 2024, 3 separate Airbus incidents surfaced almost simultaneously. A software crisis affecting 6,000 aircraft, mysterious fuselage panels built to the wrong thickness, and engines shutting down mid-flight for reasons nobody could immediately explain. Suddenly, the uncomfortable question emerged: is Airbus walking the same dangerous path that destroyed Boeing's golden reputation? How Boeing lost its soul. To understand what's at stake for Airbus today, we must first revisit the cautionary tale of Boeing, because history has a habit of repeating itself in the most unexpected places. In 1997, Boeing acquired McDonnell Douglas, a company already in slow decline. What happened next became one of corporate aviation's most studied transformations. McDonnell Douglas executives gradually replaced Boeing's own leadership, and with them came a fundamentally different philosophy, one that prioritized quarterly profits over engineering excellence. Boeing's culture shifted quietly but decisively. Instead of engineers setting the boundaries of what was safely achievable, managers began dictating targets, budgets, and deadlines from the top down. The warning signs were there: spiraling costs on the 787 Dreamliner, a development program so troubled that Boeing may never fully recoup its investment, but nobody acted fast enough. Then came the 737 MAX, and the world stopped looking away. The software shock: -6,000 planes grounded overnight. On October 30, 2024, a JetBlue Airbus A320 was cruising peacefully at 35,000 feet on its way from Cancun, Mexico to Newark, United States Flight 1230 when the aircraft suddenly pitched nose down with almost no warning. The drop was only around 100 feet, but the movement was so violent and unexpected that 10 passengers who were UN secured in their seats were thrown upward and suffered injuries. The NTSB opened an immediate investigation, and what investigators found inside the aircraft's computers would trigger a global emergency response. The fault traced back to a single flight control computer called ELAC-2. In any normal scenario, a failure in ELAC-2 should have automatically handed control to its backup, ELAC-1, but that failsafe mechanism didn't activate as designed. Weeks later, Airbus revealed that a software update, labeled L104, had left the computer vulnerable to data corruption caused by intense solar or cosmic radiation. Their response was swift and decisive. Aviation authorities worldwide issued an emergency directive, and approximately 6,000 A320 family aircraft were grounded almost immediately, one of the largest simultaneous groundings in commercial aviation history. The fix and why it mattered for most of those 6,000 grounded jets. The remedy was relatively straightforward. A technician would board each plane, connect a device to a cockpit port, and roll the software back to an earlier stable version. It sounds simple, but picture hundreds of technicians working through the night at airports across every continent, racing against time to clear aircraft before the next morning's departures. For around 5,000 of those planes, the process, while exhausting, was completed within days. However, roughly 1,000 aircraft required something more serious: the physical replacement of the ELAC computer unit itself, pulled from the avionics bay and swapped with new hardware. For those airlines, the grounding stretched close to a week, a painful operational disruption measured in cancelled flights, displaced passengers, and financial losses. What stood out, though, was Airbus's attitude throughout. When doubt emerged, they acted without hesitation. That culture of caution, many observers noted, was precisely what had been missing from Boeing during its darkest chapters. Panels built wrong, a supply chain stumbles just days after the software crisis began to settle. A second Airbus story broke, and this one came from inside the manufacturing process itself. A Spanish aerospace supplier called Sofotec, which produces fuselage panels for the front section of the A320 family, had been using a stretching and milling process that inadvertently altered the thickness of aluminium panels in ways that fell outside acceptable tolerances. Initially, reports suggested only a few dozen aircraft were affected. That number grew quickly and eventually reached 628 panel sets across the production chain. Of those 628 affected panels, 215 were still in early assembly stages and 245 were at more advanced production phases. But 177 aircraft carrying these panels had already been delivered to airline customers and were actively flying passengers. Europe's Aviation Authority, EASA, mandated detailed physical inspections of all affected in-service aircraft. Though the 6-month compliance window suggested, regulators did not consider this an immediate flight safety emergency. Airbus expressed confidence that most panels would still fall within structural tolerance, but any aircraft requiring repair faced a downtime of 3 to 5 weeks, contributing to Airbus revising its 2025 delivery target downward from 820 to 790 aircraft. Engines shutting down at 36,000 feet on December 1, 2024. Air New Zealand Flight 249 departed Wellington heading for Sydney with 142 passengers and 6 crew members aboard. The climb was smooth, lunch was served early to the flight deck crew, and the aircraft leveled off at 36,000 feet for the cruise. Then, just 15 minutes into that cruise phase, a master caution alarm sounded, and the crew watched in real time as the number 2 engine, a Pratt & Whitney unit, under the right wing began spooling down with no explanation and no warning. The crew executed a textbook drift-down procedure. Descending into denser air where single-engine performance is more manageable, worked through their checklists, informed passengers calmly, and diverted safely to Auckland. It was only after landing when a duty pilot and engineer boarded the aircraft that someone spotted what the flight crew had missed during the chaos. The fire handle for engine 2 was protruding outward in the activated position. That switch, when pulled, cuts fuel to the engine. Nobody had pulled it intentionally. The engine had been shut down by a component that activated itself, a tiny broken pin with very big consequences. Investigators discovered that the fire switch cover contained a small retaining pin that had become deformed, not during flight, but before the part was ever installed on the aircraft. According to Safran, the manufacturer of these switches, the damage most likely occurred when the component was dropped during handling at some point in the supply or maintenance chain. Disturbingly, this was not an isolated incident. 5 remarkably similar uncommanded fire switch activations had been recorded across the global Airbus fleet since 2016, with another case in October 2023 involving an A321 diverted to Barcelona under nearly identical circumstances. What makes this particularly significant is the scope of the risk. Airbus uses this exact same fire switch design across the A320, A330, A340, A340, A350, and A380, virtually its entire commercial fleet. A component that can be silently damaged by being dropped in a warehouse, and that damage then causes an engine shutdown at cruise altitude months later, represents a subtle but systemic vulnerability. The investigation into the Air New Zealand incident remains ongoing, with further safety recommendations expected when the final report is published. Warning signs, or just turbulence. So where does all of this leave us? 3 significant Airbus incidents, all surfacing within days of each other in late 2024, each involving a different layer of the aircraft ecosystem, software, manufacturing supply chains, and component handling. Industry insiders have noted for years that complacency and arrogance are not exclusively Boeing traits. Quality control concerns at Airbus's Hamburg assembly facility, slow production ramp-up issues with the A220, and reported gaps in customer support have quietly accumulated. With Airbus now targeting production of 75 A320 family aircraft per month within the next few years, the pressure on its supply chain will only intensify. Boeing's collapse was never a single dramatic failure. It was a slow accumulation of cultural drift that took decades to become catastrophic. Airbus today shows no obvious signs of the same institutional decay, and it's transparent. Rapid responses to these recent incidents are genuinely encouraging. But the lesson aviation has paid dearly to learn is this: crises do not announce themselves in advance. The question worth asking loudly and repeatedly is whether Airbus is listening carefully enough to the quiet warning sounds already beginning to emerge. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and join us at the World Documentaries for more stories that take you deeper into the world's most fascinating industries. Hit subscribe so you never miss what we uncover next. If this story made you think differently about aviation safety, drop your perspective in the comments. We read every single one. Like this video if you want more investigative documentary content. And subscribe to the World Documentaries for weekly deep dives into the forces quietly shaping our world.